Hey Trailblazers and Tarmac Tacklers, welcome to the Maximum Mileage Running Podcast. I am your host Nick Hancock, USCA and UK Athletics Qualified Coach, and I am with
Faye Johnson, Level 4 personal trainer and running coach.
And our episode today is all about strength training. Lots of stuff about strength training. I actually interviewed Dr. Richard Blagrove, or Rich as I call him. He's been on the podcast before. We've talked about strength training in general, but really interestingly, Faye, we talked about a paper that his university have produced.
Yeah.
It is a systematic review and meta-analysis titled "Do Exercise-Based Prevention Programs Reduce Injury in Endurance Runners?" Really interesting topic because it is kind of spoffed out ad nauseum by coaches all over the world that if you do strength training, you won't get injured.
Absolutely.
Which is a little bit bullshit, but now we have some evidence that kind of sort of tells us a little bit more about that because there isn't a lot out there. And it was really interesting what Rich had to say. So, I keep saying it. I kept saying it today before everybody stops listening to this podcast and goes, "Oh, well, I'll cancel my gym membership then." Yeah. It is a little bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
It is a little bit more nuanced than that. And me and Rich go into in a bit more detail about that. So yeah, it was really, really interesting to hear what he had to say. And I'll tell you all about it in a bit, Faye. But
yes.
I won't spoil it for everybody listening. Please do listen. Very good episode. I always love talking to Rich. He's very down to earth, and he puts things in because he is a practitioner as well as a professor.
Yeah.
So he's really good at putting it into context. And I forgot to do this actually when I was chatting with him, but just a little shout out for Rich. He has a book called Strength and Conditioning for Endurance Runners, available on Amazon. Lots of really good advice in there. But he goes into some of the quite scientific detail of it, as well as putting some of it into real good practical applications.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Worth a shout out. How are you, Faye?
Oh, I'm good. I am really good. I'm having a good week this week. Well, just good couple of weeks. Just feeling quite energized and enjoying my running again. Yeah. And
you had a good park run on Saturday.
Do you know what? Didn't even plan it. And this is what I've decided. I was talking to someone and they said, it just never quite works out when you plan it. And I said, well, it doesn't for me because I overthink it. But yeah. I rocked up on Saturday just going to parkrun. And then I was pleasantly surprised. So sometimes for me personally, I'm better off just going, I'll just see what happens. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. I still think that sub-20's in there somewhere.
Oh, but... It is. I think it's on its way. I just not quite yet. Not on that course. If I can do it on that course, I'll be well chuffed. So it's kind of...
It's not... It's quite flat, because I came and did it with you one day, didn't I?
Mm-hmm.
It's quite flat, but it's got some tricky corners, some chicanes. This time of year, it's probably a bit slippy in places. I mean, the day I did it with you, it was absolutely belting down with rain.
Yeah, and that's the problem. There's corners, there's mud, there's all sorts of changes of underfoot terrain. So it's, we'll see. But if I can get it on that, then I'll be chuffed. I do know where I could go and get a sub-20, but it's getting up a little bit earlier on a Saturday morning. So,
which is not your strong point.
I just don't know. Oh dear. But yeah, all is good. All is well. What about you?
Yeah, not too bad. Racing this weekend, so by the time this goes out, I will have raced. I've been keeping it relatively quiet because I entered it at a fairly late stage. But yeah, Brecon to Cardiff, which I've done twice in biblical storms, and we're not going to have that this time around, which makes a nice change. But I have entered the 10-year anniversary new version of the course. So they're doing the normal version where they just run straight down the Taff Trail.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's a little dull.
Yeah.
Sorry, Run Walk Crawl, if anybody from Run Walk Crawl is listening, but it's not the most exciting of courses, but it's very runnable. And if you want to go and do an ultra that is probably a bit less demanding,
absolutely,
I think is a good one to do. But they've now created the second version, which is Brecon to Cardiff Extreme, goes up over the Fans Yeah, I think we talked about this last week, actually.
But yeah, a great,
Fanny Big.
yeah. But
Fanny Big.
it's a nice alternative to the original race.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I'm doing that this weekend. Not really taking it terribly seriously. I was saying just before we started, I get typical like paranoia.
Paranoia.
Like everything started hurting. You know, I've now got hamstring tendonitis, and my knee's about to blow up, and my glutes don't want to work anymore. And it's like I'm like, oh no, but it's proper paranoia. I'll be fine on race day. So yeah. All training's all gone quite well. I've knocked out a couple of 70-mile weeks in peak weeks, which was quite surprising actually, because I'm not really being terribly structured with my training at the moment, just because of the fluidity of life that I've got at the minute. But yeah, no, I'm pretty happy with that. So yeah, that's going on. I went to the Arc of Attrition this weekend.
You did.
Just gone, which was amazing actually, and I put a little gushy post on Instagram this morning or yesterday. It's quite an amazing race, and I'm going to get Fergie on the podcast at some point actually to talk about it, because it is one of those races I think that you can come away from being involved in it in some shape or form. So I went down there to crew my 3 runners, or certainly support my 3 runners, and all 3 of them finished. Daryl did the 100-miler in a bloody phenomenal 27 hours.
Yeah.
And then James and Simon both finished the 50-miler. Simon's was his first ever ultra.
Yeah.
To do the Arc of Attrition is his first ever ultra in 12 and a half hours.
Fair play to him. Yeah.
Yeah. So I went down there, and it's just one of those races I think that you can come away from with that feeling that it has a bit of magic in it.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Just suddenly got this overwhelming affinity to it now. Not overwhelming urge to do it, but even if I went down there next year to watch, and just be part of it, it's one of those kind of races. So yeah, amazing, just amazing. And Mark Derbyshire destroyed his previous record. He did it in just under 19 hours, which is
amazing.
Disgusting, really. So but yeah, no, kudos to everybody that took part in it.
Absolutely.
And finished it. Like I was down at various points in the course, and you're sort of getting into 24, 30 hours after starting, and there are people that have still got like 15, 20 miles to go. And just seeing people crossing the line in the dark on the second night.
That's it. Was
pretty inspiring actually. It was just pretty amazing to see all these awesome human beings. It's awesome that you've got Mark Derbyshire smashing records in running it in 19 hours, but actually I think sometimes it's the people that are doing it in 30, 35, 36 hours.
I totally agree with you. Like, and I think he'd say exactly the same, I think, because that time, that is a significant amount of extra time to be out there and to keep going. Yeah. And like, do you know what would get me is that second night. I think going into a second night would just be that would be hard to deal with. Yeah,
so that was awesome, and I found 2 excellent fish and chip shops. So,
well, that's good then.
When I do the race, I'm going to be like, right, crew, you're going to that shop to get me some sausage and chips.
Oh, funny.
Yeah, no, really good. Met some cool people down there. Got to meet David Miller, who I've interviewed on here before. Saw my mate Holly Stables, who has been on here before as well. She had an amazing race in the women's race on the 50. Her and Poppy Collingwood were just ding dong all the way until I think it was about 44 miles. Poppy just got the better of Holly, but what a race! Absolutely amazing. So yeah, got all emotional about it. Just what a great race to be at.
Yeah, absolutely. It did look fantastic, and I enjoyed following all of it as it was going on.
Faye,
Yeah.
What is our coaching tip of the week?
So I
What are we
thought
going to
we
talk
would
about?
talk about, just to obviously this is a strength, focused episode, strength training focused. I thought it would be good to talk about where we, where do we put our strength training sessions during a week, during a training week. I know from a personal perspective, but also from those that I'm coaching, I often have that conversation about, Faye, when should I put my strength training session in so that I don't have, DOMs, for a run the next day or the day after that, or where can I put my strength training in the week to get the most out of it?
Good one. I've got my views on that,
No, I think
as I always
no, I
do,
think
Fred.
this
You
is a
know
really
that.
valuable conversation because I think it can
Yeah,
be really hard to get the balance right. As I was saying to you before we
definitely.
started, I went to
Mm,
the gym this morning. My week is a bit different this week because I'm busy at the weekend and I won't be running. But I potentially went a little bit hard today in the gym. So I know I'm going to pay for
mm,
that tomorrow, but I've got an easy run plan tomorrow. So, and then I've got a weekend where I'm not really doing any running. So that's
yeah.
fine. But on a normal week, it's that moderate, it's how you balance it, it's the intensity, it's everything else that you've got to fit around it with
Mm.
your training.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I hear all the time that coaches will spit out is that you should keep your hard days hard and your easy days easy. However, anecdotally, no, not anecdotally, this isn't anecdotal at all. What I have seen with the kind of people I coach and are going to be listening to this episode, you know, busy people who are, maybe a little bit older than, I think that hard days hard, easy days easy, from my perspective, is that, if you're a 23-year-old elite male athlete, which most studies are always done on, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Um, yeah, fine. You probably can work pretty hard on a day and do two hard sessions, hard intervals followed by
Mm.
hard strength work. But just from what I've seen with the people I work, and this is me personally as well, I actually struggle to do strength training on the same day as a hard session. I just find it too exhausting. Like, I am absolutely spent the next day. Um, and yeah, just sort of, subjectively, that's the kind of feedback I've got from people I coach as well. It just tends to not be that way. Now, that isn't the same for everybody. I do tend to always go with, right, let's do your hard days hard and
Yeah.
your easy days easy, but let's see what feedback comes through over the course of time.
Mm.
Um, and I would say 9 times out of 10, most people will say, I prefer to do my strength days on separate days to running completely because of time
Yeah. Often. Yeah.
aspects.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of people that we coach, they can't do strength and run on the same day just because of time. But then, yeah, sort of subjectively, I get that feedback over time that actually, I'm just, I start seeing comments like, "Oh, I'm really tired after, yesterday's hard session and strength training,"
Yeah.
and I just keep coming back to hard days hard, easy days easy. Just doesn't seem to work for people who are kind of my age and older. And so yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I tend to end up almost going with hard day, get your sleep in
Yes.
and your protein and eat well and rest and all of that good stuff, and then the next day that might be a hard run,
Mm.
or actually usually the other way around. I'll usually have like a hard run and then the next day is strength
Yes.
because it's a bit easier on the central nervous system.
Totally agree with you. And I think with the people that I'm coaching, similarly, often it will be a separate day. So the strength training will come on a separate day. Again, that comes down to time, also comes down to experience and their kind of physical experience of overload and volume of training. Because I always think
Yeah.
to say to someone, oh right, so you're being coached by me now, that means that you have to do, you know, this run on this day, then you're going to do an easy run, and then you're going to do a strength session. It all gets a bit too much, and it's not a sensible approach. Like you said, these are normal people who are looking for an all-round kind of achievable and sustainable training load. We're going to have harder weeks, we're going to have easier weeks, but I think it's important as well, and this is something I always talk about, is we want quality from these sessions. I know we've spoken about this because you told me off for running parkrun too quickly every week, which was then having a knock-on effect on my Monday speed session, because on Sunday I was running long, so I was just tired, and then I'd come to Monday speed session and be like, Nick, I'm exhausted, I can't do it. So it's the same with strength training, and it's thinking about the time as well from doing that strength session and the old DOMS that comes about. That's not necessarily going to come about 12 hours later. It might be 24, 48 hours. So it's thinking about that as well, especially if you're new to strength training. We all remember the days, or, if you've just not been to the gym for a while, you go and do a session and you don't half feel it the next day. But, it's about finding that balance. But I think I always go back to quality and thinking, are we getting quality out of this session? And like you say, are they getting enough sleep? Are they fueling? Are they refueling? Are they recovering well? And all the many other factors that come into it.
Yeah, me and Rich talk about this as well. It is a multifactorial approach, and I think it's also just worth mentioning that the kind of strength training that I give to my athletes, and I know you do too. It isn't a 2-hour hammering in the gym. It's a 40-minute running specific strength session with ideally heavy weight, and heavy is relative to the person. That is enough to give the athlete, the person doing it, the adaptations that we want without going too far with it. Like if somebody comes out of a strength session that I've given them with major DOMs, then did they do too much? Did they go off plan? Like they shouldn't be coming out of them with major DOMs. They shouldn't be hammering the central nervous system.
No.
So yeah, it's a bit of a from a coaching tip point of view, I would say to people, try and do your hard days hard. However, listen to your body.
Yeah.
And if you feel exhausted, like I do, and many people I've seen that I coach, and the reason I say start at that point is because that is generally where the evidence points to.
Yeah, exactly.
You should keep your hard days hard and your easy days easy. But unfortunately, I continue to not see that. Yeah,
I agree with you. It's certainly not as black and white as that at all, especially for the normal person like me and you, who and those that we coach. It's just not realistic, is it? So
yeah, and I think if you do get into you get into the gym and your legs are hurting a little bit, you can feel your speed session that you perhaps did earlier in the morning or yesterday in your legs, then maybe just dial it back a little bit off your strength work. Maybe you might have done a 50 kilo squat last week, but if you're feeling that strength session in your legs a little bit, maybe do 40.
Yeah,
just listen to yourself. You don't need to stick another 5 kilos on the barbell just because we tell you that progressive overload is a thing. You need to be listening to your body as well.
Exactly.
Cool. Shout out to our partners, Runderwear, Talk,
Ugoku.
Protein Works.
Oh, Protein Works.
Ugoku, of course. Got the hats on here for the people that can see it on here. Who else? Soulmate over in Merthyr. I'll probably pop in there on Saturday before I head off to the race registration. I bought a pair of shoes in there the other day actually with my maximum mileage discount.
Lovely.
Which, anybody can use maximum 10. That's the code on the Soulmate website.
Yeah, go to the website or go to the shop. Yeah.
Yeah, I ideally go to the shop because you can get a proper gait analysis. I
And
bleated on about
a
this before.
coffee as well. What's
And
better,
a nice
running and
coffee, yes.
coffee? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think
True
that's
Start coffee.
True Start
True Start
Coffee,
coffee.
of course. True Start Coffee, yeah. Again, we're a bit rubbish at this ad thing. That's why they're not really ads. We just like working with these companies, and if you join the Maximum Mileage Running Podcast Facebook group, you can get discounts at all of them. Our runners, actually, I've had quite a few of the people I coach saying, "Oh, I jumped on and availed some of that discounts with Talk or
I have,
Protein Works." Here, I've got a couple
yeah,
of people that have been doing that. So
I've definitely
um,
popped a Ugoku hat on many a person head round here in my town anyway.
yeah,
A few people are wearing
it's
them
good.
now.
Yeah. Well, my finisher of the Arc 100 was Daryl, who is the owner of Ugoku. They are lovely hats. As I said on a previous podcast, fuck CL. Ugoku hats are the best.
Yes.
Anyway, there's me and my potty mouth. Let's listen to Rich Blagrove talk about injury prevention, strength training. Does it actually work? Let's see. Hey, Rich, how you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, Nick. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Good to have you back on the podcast. We had a really good podcast, and as I was saying before we started recording, it's one of my most downloaded podcasts. You know, people want to know about strength training for runners. It is definitely, the good word is getting out there.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me back. It's
yeah,
it can't have gone too badly that first one.
No, not at all. It was great.
Invite to come back.
Well, the reason I have brought you back is because we've got some interesting data, interesting information to talk about as part of a study that your good university has put out there in the world. But before we start talking about that, just for anybody who hasn't listened to the other podcast that you came on, who are you?
Yeah, so my name is Rich Blagrove. I'm a senior lecturer at Loughborough University, where I also run the Masters in Strength and Conditioning that we've got there. I come from a running background myself. I was, I guess, an all right middle distance runner 20 or so years ago, and switched sports and did rowing for a little bit. But running's always been my main passion and interest. And when I started getting involved with strength and conditioning coaching, I kind of specialised in work with middle and long distance runners. And I've been working in universities since 2008 and become sort of more research active as time's gone on. And yeah, inevitably I've wanted to specialise in research around performance and health issues with runners.
Yeah, you're doing a lot of stuff with around bone health at the moment, right? That's kind of
getting into more of that. Particularly around how we kind of manage and then treat a syndrome called relative energy deficiency in sport, which is essentially kind of disordered eating and even runs into eating disorders in athletes.
Yeah.
That's obviously quite useful and impactful research with athletes that experience that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, an important topic, and one I am definitely going to be covering on the podcast at some point. So that'll be a good segue for that. Thanks, Rich. The reason we've connected again, and I've asked you to come on because, as I said in the intro, there your good university have put out some recent study, and the title of the article, which I will put in the show notes, is "Do exercise-based prevention programs reduce injury in endurance runners? A systematic review and meta-analysis." So, which essentially means that you guys have looked at a multitude of other studies to, come up with the results of the paper. And it's interesting because it's, we were talking about this off air, that there are a lot of publications, and for many, many years, if you do strength training, you won't get injured. And we talked about this briefly on the last podcast, that isn't quite how it works. And now this study kind of sheds a bit of light on it. So, could you sort of briefly summarize the research on exercise-based injury prevention in endurance runners?
Yeah, sure. It's been a long time coming, this paper, actually, because I remember speaking about it at a conference like back in, I don't know, it was probably pre-COVID times. And I had a kind of table of results, but hadn't really done it properly. So I've got to mention from the outset that my PhD student called Henry Wu, like he led on this work, and obviously supported him a fair bit as his supervisor, but he did the main legwork that goes behind this paper. So I've got to give him credit.
Yeah,
But yeah, I guess on the last podcast we spoke quite a bit about the use of strength training to enhance performance related metrics with runners, and there's definitely some quite good evidence for that. But we've done a couple of surveys in the past that have asked runners that do strength and conditioning, like why do you do it? Like, what's the main motivation, and what are your goals when you go to the gym or you do any sort of home based strength and conditioning? And fairly consistently in quite large groups of runners, we see that the main reason that they're engaging with it is that they've got this belief that it reduces the risk of them getting injured. And I was kind of aware that wasn't sure how many studies there were, but there was enough to do a systematic review on it. And so, yeah, we went into the literature, and like you kind of go through this, like it's called a systematic review for a reason, that there's quite a sort of methodological and tight protocol for how you search all the literature. But yeah, we came back with 9 studies across nearly 2,000 runners that have looked at the use of, like we called it exercise-based prevention, but it's essentially strength and conditioning. So various different strength and conditioning interventions that had taken a group of runners, split them into 2 subgroups, one that did the strength and conditioning intervention for quite a long period of time, and then compared them to a control group that essentially just carried on their normal running training. And we were able, as part of the meta-analysis, which is essentially just a statistical technique for gathering together all of the data and looking at what the effect is. So we looked at both injury risk and injury rate in the 2 groups across these 9 different studies. And essentially the main headline, which you were alluding to before, was that the 9 studies showed that there isn't a kind of positive protective effect of doing S&C for a long period of time, at least in terms of these 2 measures, in injury risk and injury rate.
Yeah, interesting. And before everybody turns the podcast off and there's a mutiny from the gyms, please keep listening, because we'll sort of get into some of the more granular bits of this. But you mentioned there sort of there were different studies that were obviously looked at. I guess one of my questions, kind of an offshoot of that, is were there differences in the types of S&C that were done? Heavy versus using bands versus body weight versus then the control groups that didn't do any at all.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I mean, I think when like on the last podcast that I came on, when we talk about strength and conditioning, like runners will usually associate that with going to the gym and doing some sort of weight training, and then maybe some sort of conditioning based exercises in more of a home based environment. But what none of the studies really did very well, so none of the 9 studies, was they didn't do any, like, what I would consider proper strength training. So there was some exercises with bands, there was some that used light dumbbells, but most of the studies were using body weight. There was a few that used kind of like low intensity jumping exercises, and most were kind of, to answer your question, sort of multimodal in nature. So lots of different training activities as part of the intervention, rather than just lifting heavy weights or just doing plyometric training. So I think that's certainly a gap, and something that needs to be addressed with future studies. That it'd be good just to do what I think we would consider like a sort of proper strength training intervention over a long period of time, to see if that has a more positive effect. I don't know if I'm kind of preempting your next question, but there was an interesting pattern that we saw around supervision versus non-supervision.
Yeah. So you are preempting one. I mean,
Yeah.
because I am going to ask about that, but I just sort of wanted to go back to that, because that's the thing. When we're talking about strength and conditioning, unless there are major limitations for and we talked about this in the last podcast, does somebody have time limitations? Do they have
Yeah.
cost limitations? Gyms can be quite expensive. There are some very good cheap gyms out there now too, but so for the bulk of the runners that I coach, they're lifting heavy, and even if they're at home with a couple of up to 25 kilo adjustable dumbbells, I'll get them doing things that are going to enact some sort of what I would call proper strength training, because banded body weight, that can be really helpful either from a rehab perspective or if somebody is really, really, really new to strength
in the early
conditioning.
days.
But that only lasts for so long, right? We need them to start picking up
Absolutely,
some heavy stuff, So we'll sort of come back to that, I think. But there was something that was really interesting, and you did preempt me, is that there was a difference between supervised strength and conditioning versus non-supervised strength and conditioning. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. And I kind of mentioned before that I guess like our primary aim was to look at all of these 9 studies, and you push all the data together to try to come up with a solid conclusion. And as I said, the headline was that they didn't seem to have any positive effect. But one thing that we did notice, that out of the 9 studies, there were several that had seen a positive effect. So then as kind of part of your sort of thorough reviewing of all those papers, you sort of have a look at, okay, are there any patterns that are emerging? Are there any sort of characteristics linked to those studies that might offer reasons why that they found a positive effect versus others? And there was with those studies that we looked at. And so we found all 3 of them that had found a positive effect had used much more close supervision compared to the other studies. And linked to that close supervision, the adherence or the compliance to the program was a little bit higher. So about 80 to 90% of the prescribed sessions had actually been done in those 3 studies, whereas in the other 6 that hadn't used supervision, it was more like 60 to 70% of sessions completed, which I'm sure you'd agree, like it's not that many. And to get a sort of physiological adaptation, you need to be engaging with the program that's been set. Yeah. And so we split those studies up and essentially did a separate, what we call a kind of post hoc analysis on just the studies that had used supervision. And that did produce a positive effect. The reason it doesn't become the headline is, well, firstly, it wasn't the primary aim. But secondly, like we can't have that much confidence in just 3 studies because the sample size is so small. And so it's kind of one of those, more nuanced findings, I guess, that there might be something going on in terms of if runners just stick to the program, if they're supervised in some sort of way, whether that be online or in person, like they're much more likely to get a reduction in injury risk, which is obviously much more important. So we're not just, cancelling our gym membership or throwing away our home dumbbells. Like there definitely might be something there. And so it's worth other studies exploring that, I think.
So because that was kind of where one of my questions was going to lead on that supervision versus non-supervision. Does online count? Because, like, for example, I mean, Training Peaks, which is the platform I use to program people's running, have now released their strength training beta, which so far looks really good. I've only had it since Monday, but throughout the course of this week, I'm starting to see my runners, completing their strength sessions. But as part of what I would call supervision, is that I want to see that when they've done the session, they've recorded the weights they've lifted, the sets they've done, the reps they've done, and it turns the box in Training Peaks green, like it does when they go out and do a run. The data that comes through on their watch turns the box green, and if they don't do it, it turns yellow. If they're kind of close, if they do something completely random, it goes orange, and if they just don't do it at all, it goes red. So, from that supervision point, because a lot of people, particularly newer people that are new to strength and conditioning, they kind of want that supervision almost to be like a PT stood next to them counting, doing reps. So is that the sort of the supervision that you saw in the studies was more kind of in person, or was it a mixture?
It was a bit of a mixture. So the way that we defined supervision was online or in-person supervision was provided at least once a week. So I can't remember exactly what each of the three studies did, but there was definitely at least one of them that had a bit like this kind of environment online, like had the coach looking in on how they were doing the exercises, and they asked any questions, and yeah, they'd make sure everything was recorded accurately. But one or two of the studies did use actual in-person kind of coaching, and so that there was presence of a qualified practitioner to kind of make sure the exercises were being done well and probably feeding back on technique and so on. But you compare that to the other 6 studies, and it was essentially, here's your program, we'll see you in 6 weeks for an update. And then they got an update, see you in another 6 weeks. And they were basically just reporting how many sessions they'd done. Online. So that's obviously not quite as strong a design as it is either online or in-person supervision.
Yeah.
It's probably worth mentioning that, like, we think that the 3 studies that use supervision, the reason why that worked was the higher adherence. Like I said, that they're actually engaging with the strength training program, but it might not.
It's almost that, just having that accountability to somebody that
Yeah.
is going to help. Because I put my hand up, in the past when I've been left to my own devices, I'll go in and I might do one set of each exercise and I've done it, box ticked,
Yeah,
off
I'm
I go.
tired or I'm in a rush or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there obviously might still be an element that if the program's supervised, people put in a slightly higher level of effort because there's somebody there watching them. Like if there is some feedback and coaching going on, then technique might be a little bit better, perhaps. But the studies didn't really report or measure those sorts of things. But it might also be one of the mechanisms by which the supervision is superior. And the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that, like, when programs are supervised and people stick to them, like, that also might be reflective of just the runner being conscious about their injury prevention strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might reflect that they just have healthy behaviours generally, that they're kind of aware that, okay, strength and conditioning might reduce my injury risk, but also eating very well might reduce my injury risk and enhance my recovery. Getting at least 7 hours sleep a night is going to help my recovery and prevent injury. So they might have all of these kind of healthy behaviours in the background that are going on in addition to their strength training. And so therefore that kind of shows up in these studies as, well, supervision's important. But it might just be that they're very conscientious runners as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something, when I'm coaching my guys here, I say I get all this data coming through from their Garmin watches, and whilst I'm a little bit kind of nervous about getting too much into what a watch says, but actually there's a study out recently that shows that watches are terrible at measuring things like sleep scores and sleep cycles and stages and things. But actually one thing they were very good at was being pretty accurate with the length of sleep. So I see that data, and I having those kind of touch points with each of your athletes, as well as the strength and conditioning compliance. I think you're right. It is kind of a, are they completing all their runs? Are they doing all their strength training? Are they sleeping minimum 7 hours a night? Are they eating enough? All of that kind of stuff is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, some key messages there for sure.
Yeah. So I think, like, the big question is, for so long we've been led to believe, and we've talked about this before. Some coaches will, almost market themselves as, if you do this strength program that I'm going to give you, you won't get injured at all, which I've always found, wrong, because the studies have shown, even look at the likes of, Mo Farah and Kipchoge and all these guys out there, in the professional world, they get injured.
Yeah.
So, we've been led to believe that, injury prevention is something that strength training would do. But what practical advice, would or could you give based on the research?
Yeah, and I think runners and coaches, like, they always want kind of quite a binary answer to these sorts of questions. That like, should I do strength and conditioning? Like, will it reduce my risk of injury? Yes or no? And as we've already discussed, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And I think there's a bit more to it. And so if people have got the time to read the paper, they'll realise, particularly in the discussion section, and as we've summarised already, there is a little bit more to it than that. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, the main message that emerges from the paper is if people can afford it, or if they know somebody that's qualified or competent at writing S&C programs, it's probably worth seeking some advice from a professional and getting an individualized S&C program that you can then report back to that coach or that practitioner about how it's going, and hopefully get some input into your technique, and they can coach you a little bit. And as you said before, that kind of holds you accountable to the program. And so, like, if runners just engage and they do it consistently, like two or three times a week for a long period of time, that's likely to maximize the benefit that you're going to get from strength and conditioning, if there is a benefit there. I mean, in terms of the actual sort of prescription, like as we were sort of alluding to before, there wasn't too many patterns that emerged. Like, of the studies that did find a benefit, they seem to be using a frequency of 2 to 4 times a week, which sounds like quite a lot, like doing S&C 4 times a week, but the sessions don't have to be super long.
No.
And so, yeah, it's not necessarily a case of doing 4 times 1 hour a week, that you can probably get away with doing 20 to 30 minutes at a time and kind of almost microdosing it, like at quite a high frequency through the week. There wasn't really any specific training activity that seemed to work better than others. And so it's probably worth like doing some resistance training, doing some plyometrics, doing some kind of specific conditioning on the tissues that are vulnerable to injury in runners. And yeah, of the studies that did seem to show an effect, that's the type of approach that they were using.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't be advising everybody to go running for the hills now with strength training, because apparently it doesn't prevent injury or stop injury. But certainly, I still use the moniker. I can't remember what book it's from, but weak things break.
Mm.
And if we can get strong, that is surely going to help us. But also, all of the other benefits. For anybody who's looking to improve their running, as you alluded to in the beginning, we know it helps with a myriad of other things. Running economy, even VO2 max, and it's and just I certainly anecdotally, myself from being an ultra runner, mountain runner, I get up hills much better than I used to since I started doing heavy squats. So
yeah, exactly, yeah. And most of what we've spoken about so far in this podcast is just about kind of injury risk and prevention. But as you're mentioning, there's a multitude of other performance and health benefits to engaging with strength training in particular that are very well evidenced. And I think, I mean, I should have maybe mentioned it at the start, but an S&C coaches will know this very well because they sort of hang their hat on it as their major sales pitch. But like outside of this review, there's probably, like I think we mentioned, about 8 different reviews in the paper that have got tens of thousands of athletes in, that there is very, very good evidence from other sports and other populations, particularly youth athletes, that S&C offers an injury prevention effect. And that there's quite a few in the military as well. And obviously with military training, like they do a high volume of hikes and running and so on. Like it's probably not quite the same as what runners do, but there's some quite good evidence from military studies that that offsets the risk of them getting injured. And so I think a lot of S&C coaches in particular will argue that the studies in this area, specifically with endurance runners, just haven't been done, and they haven't been done very well. And so the evidence is maybe to come. And so, yeah, as you say, it's probably not worth dismissing S&C just based on the headline of this paper, because there's a bit more to it. And there's good evidence from other sports, so maybe the research hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, and also there's there's just the general health benefits in terms of longevity, and as we get older, sort of as soon as you start, like I said, north of 40, women as they get older, there's just so many benefits to doing strength training that I would say, even if you don't think it's going to benefit your running, or you've decided that, well, if it's not going to prevent injury like I thought it was going to, please keep doing it, because it's hugely worth it, and actually it can be quite enjoyable if you really get into it. So that's another thing that people struggle with, is the enjoyment side of lifting weights.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, completely agree with all that.
So you touched on it before. So given the limitations of current research in the area, what future studies do you think you'd like to see conducted, and how do you think they'd be put together?
Yeah, it's worth saying that like we criticize all of these 9 studies that go into reviews like this, but like it's not really a criticism of the authors and the researchers that lead them, because what we recognize is like research is really really hard in this area. Like you essentially need a very very big group of runners, because you need to see enough injuries in the 2 different groups to get a
Mm,
comparison. Trying to get a really large group of runners is very difficult. Trying to retain them in a study is even more difficult. And then when you add in things like, well, half of them need to be supervised around what they're doing, like it's an incredibly costly and time
mm,
intensive study. And so we can sit here and say, oh yeah, we need better studies, but it's important to recognise that they are quite hard to do. Um, I think the other thing worth mentioning is like you compare research in this area to research in like medicine, for example, and like drugs trials. And in studies like that, like they can obviously blind participants to treatment. That like there's a clinical diagnosis from a doctor. Like the participants tend to get paid because it's well funded, so you can retain them
yeah,
for quite long periods of time. And like research S&C for runners, like the studies don't really have those sorts of characteristics, and so it tends to be weaker evidence than other areas of science and medicine. Um, Having said all of that, it would be nice to see some larger scale, like more long term prospective studies that have got that element of supervision. And as I was mentioning before, like if a study could be done where there's a proper progressive program of strength
mm,
training, which is part of it, I think that would be really useful to see. Um, I think the other area which I'm sort of collaborating with some of the researchers elsewhere in the UK on around injuries and illness in youth runners is like we're obviously just looking at kind of one training activity or one factor here. Like the question is, does S&C prevent injury? But overuse injury in runners is multidimensional and multifactorial. There's probably quite a few reasons why runners get injured. And if all of those reasons come together at the same time, like it does manifest as pain or like
yeah,
some sort of breakdown of tissue. And so what we're essentially trying to do with input from like quite a few expert clinicians is almost come up with like a bit of a point system that we can identify that there's maybe 10 different areas that might contribute towards injury in runners. All of those 10 areas have got quite weak evidence, but when you start to add them all together,
mm,
and you're not adopting healthy behaviours across those 10 areas, then the likelihood you're going to get an injury is going to be quite high. And so you might be able to set up some sort of point system. And so just to give you an example, like one might be, are you regularly engaging in S&C? It's like a 1 or a 0. Are you getting 7 hours plus of sleep a night? Like that's a 1 or a 0.
yeah.
Have you had any injuries in the last 2 years? Because we know that previous injury is a major predictor of future injury.
And it doesn't have
Um,
to be the same injury either. It could be an injury that
no,
you've had
exactly.
in
Yeah,
one part of the body leads to an issue in a different part of the body.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like, are you under like a high amount of stress? Have you got a positive mood? Are you experiencing anxiety symptoms? Things like that. Like we know those sorts of psychosocial things might also underpin injury. Like menstrual cycles in females are a really important barometer of energy availability. So like when you start, that's just sort of 5 or 6 examples. But when you start to add up all of those
Mm,
things, like if people are hitting zeros in every single area, like that's probably a big red flag for there's probably an
yeah,
injury around the corner. If it's like some are zeros, some are ones, then there's maybe sort of a kind of moderate risk. But
yeah.
you kind of want to be hitting ticks in each of those boxes, and that would probably be indicative of okay, you've got quite a low risk of injury. So that might be a different sort of strategy for research to go down.
And also from a practical element as well, because I see it all too often that when a runner gets injured, the oftentimes the physio will automatically go, "Oh, well, you're running too much," and it's kind of well,
Yes. Yeah.
but don't just look at just because you think that 40 miles a week of running is too much, that's your opinion. Actually, what is the bigger picture? How much stress are they under? Are they eating right?
Yeah.
Like you say, it is so multifactorial that you can't just say, oh, it's because you've run 40 miles this week and last week you did 36.
Yeah, exactly.
Now you've gone too much. It is just so multifactorial.
Yeah, and the running training behaviours would be like a major part of that type of point system. As you say, if somebody's been running, take an extreme example that an elite runner would use. Like if someone's been running 120 miles a week and they've been doing that every single week for 6 months, like they haven't really changed their training volume or intensity very much. And so it's probably not like the volume or the intensity per se that's going to cause the injury. It's kind of like a sudden change in it. So if somebody goes from 40 miles a week to 60 miles a week, like that's probably going to be one of the red flags a little bit, that you've got a sudden jump in the running volume that you're doing. We've actually got another study coming out that shows, if people jump from doing 0 interval training sessions a week just to doing 1 interval training sessions a week, that's one of the major risk factors for injury. Like it's only retrospective data that we're basing it on, but it seems that a sudden jump in intensity, even 1 session a week, is quite risky. Whereas if somebody's doing 3 or 4 interval training sessions a week, which is quite a lot, that's actually representative. But they're doing it consistently. That's actually represents quite a low risk of injury because they're just doing it every single week. And so, these kind of sudden changes in running training behaviours is probably a big part of the reason why runners get injured.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's kind of where sort of one of my coaching methodologies comes in is, when intensity goes up, volume must come down because, you've got to get that balance right. If you're doing a bunch of, let's say you're running 50 miles a week, which is probably a bit more realistic for the kind of people I coach. And then all of a sudden, we add into that 50 miles a week, 10 by 400 hard efforts. That is going to have an effect. Whereas, 50 miles a week with, 2 by 30-minute tempo is probably, a lot less strenuous on the body. Whereas those 400 hard efforts are going to, be quite up there on the intensity scale. So.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's stressing slightly different tissues to what you'd be doing with your long, slow distance 50 miles a week. So, it kind of shifts the stress somewhere else. And if those areas aren't robust enough to cope with the new stress, then potentially, it's going to cause a niggle.
Yeah. As we start to wrap up, kind of one of my sort of thoughts here then is just to, as I like to do is, for people to kind of take away, a little bit of information and apply it to their own training. Where do people go from here? Is it because of those studies, they were very body weight, as you say, some banded work. There wasn't really much in terms of using heavy weight. And I haven't plugged your book yet. We your book is kind of partly, but one of my Bibles, and it is heavy stuff. There is the conditioning side using bands and the plyometric work as well. But what would you be saying to people now? They've listened to this. What would you say they go away and do?
Yeah, I think to summarise some of what we've already spoken about, I think getting some sort of coaching or input from a professional is probably a good idea. And if they can hold you accountable to actually doing it, that seems to be the most important thing. Yeah. Like doing S&C between 2 to 4 times a week seems to be most beneficial in terms of injury prevention. And if that can be a mixture of, proper strength work, like a little bit of plyometric training, and then some specific conditioning for areas that might be at risk of injury, that seems to be most important. And then thirdly, as we've just spoken about, like it's definitely important that runners are considering like broader healthy behaviours in their lifestyle, as well as making sure that they're managing their running workload effectively and they're not experiencing sudden jumps in either volume or intensity or frequency of training that's going to place areas of the lower limb at an increased amount of stress too quickly. So probably those 3 things, I guess, are the main take homes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'd add in, we've touched on it, but I'd add in something when I interviewed a guy called Mike James, and
Oh yeah,
a line he came up with was, be world class at the basics, not
yes, yeah,
basic at the world class. And that's some of the things we've talked about. Get enough sleep, eat enough, hydrate enough, try and reduce some of your stress. Forget about your foam rollers and your,
yeah, yeah.
all of that stuff is really useful. I say it time and time again. I even got a Shakti mat yesterday, which was, oh my God,
Oh yeah, I
I've
saw
never
that. Yeah,
experienced anything quite as frightening in all my life. But I'm using that kind of stuff because I know I get 8 hours of sleep a night pretty much
yeah,
every night. I eat really well. And those are the basics, and we should be world class at those, not trying to be, basic at
yeah.
using massage guns and things like that.
No, that is a really important message, and we haven't mentioned any of those things. And yeah, the evidence is a little bit mixed around those, and I don't know.
Mm.
Some of them might give an elite runner like an extra 0.5% here and there in
Mm-hmm.
terms of recovery. Particularly there's a big kind of belief element that if somebody uses like one of those kind of ergogenic strategies and they really, really believe it works, that's quite powerful.
Mm.
Like it seems to speed up recovery a little bit, and there's some quite good evidence around that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like you say, get the big rocks right in terms of your running training, your S&C, and your general lifestyle behaviours, and that will take you a long way. It probably takes you to the 95% of, okay, I've got all bases covered here.
Yeah.
And then these other little things might add something, but then again, they might not.
Yeah, indeed. Rich, thank you very much for coming on. Once again, how can people find you? How can people get in touch if they want to ask questions about the paper?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, or X as it's now called. My handle's at rich_Blagrove, spelled Blagrove. It's probably the best place. Or yeah, you can feel free to email me at r.c.blagrove@elbro, which is short for Loughborough, so LBORO.ac.uk. And yeah, if anybody really wants to fund this study that we've been talking about, definitely get in touch.
Yeah. I think it would take like a Nike or a Adidas
No,
or something
no,
to put
yeah,
put the
yeah,
funds up for that kind of thing. And who knows? Maybe one day they will, because injury prevention, injuries in general are just a blight on the running world. I think I saw something like it's like 80% of
yeah.
runners
It's
at
really
any
high.
one time have an injury of some kind.
Yeah, there's studies like that. It's like the range that they report is vast. But you're right. Like some have shown up to about 95% of runners get injured every single year.
Yeah.
And we've got a study coming out with park runners around how many park run participants get injured, and that was
Wow.
ridiculously high. It was over 3/4 miss at least one park run every single year because of injury, and the cumulative time on average that they're having to modify training. So they're not necessarily not running, but they're modifying training because they're in pain or they've got an injury. Was about 3 months per year.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's like a quarter of the year people are suffering, and having to miss park runs. And if they do it every single week, that is a bit of an issue.
Yeah, because it feeds back into things like mental health, which our mental
Yeah,
health service in the UK is under a lot of pressure at the moment, and I know a lot of people rely on their exercise in general, not just running, but their exercise in general to navigate some of that stuff. I'm one of them.
yeah, 100%. And yeah, like my health hasn't been great since Christmas. To be honest, I've not been able to run very much, and it does get you down. Like if you can only sit on a spin bike and that's all you can do, it's not as enjoyable as doing the sport that you love.
Yeah, indeed. Rich, thank you so much once again for coming on. I will have you back. I still want to talk to you about plyometrics. Actually, there's some good stuff to talk about there. So we'll get you back on. And thanks for coming on.
That sounds great. Thanks very much for the invite again, Nick.
No worries. Cheers, Rich.
Cheers.